Friends, welcome to the second Wednesday of Lent 2021. This season, as people of Christ at Prince of Peace, we're focusing on some readings of Martin Luther. And I selected these readings because they focus on confession and forgiveness, and they point us in the direction of our God who hears confession and is always ready to forgive. And that assurance carries us through. Martin Luther is very strong in his writings to emphasize the peace and the gift of forgiveness for sinners like me and you. Tonight, I want to read a portion of the book of Jonah and share a reflection that Martin Luther wrote on that reading. Jonah, as you know, is an Old Testament story. We're familiar with it, probably from young childhood. We've heard the story of Jonah and the whale. It is a story that assures forgiveness because if you remember, the people of Nineveh are under the judgment of God, and when they hear God's call to repent, that Jonah finally relents and delivers to the people there, they repent and God forgives them. That is the pattern of assurance that this book reinforces. The portion I want to read tonight is from the first chapter of Jonah, and it describes the storm and how Jonah and the crew of the ship that he is on, of the boat, deal with the storm. In it is the implicit understanding that God is judging them. And Jonah takes responsibility for what he believes he has done, fleeing from God. The Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each one cried out to his God. They threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down to the hold of the ship, and had laid down, and was fast asleep. The captain came and said to him, "What are you doing, sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so that we do not perish." The sailors said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots so that we may know on whose account this calamity has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us why this calamity has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" "I am a Hebrew," he replied. "I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were even more afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them so. Martin Luther used that passage as a springboard to write about confession and particularly about our own need to see our sin and acknowledge our sin to God. In return, sinners receive God's forgiveness and the peace that comes with that. So let me share these words from Martin Luther. Luther wrote, "From the story of Jonah, we learn how to free ourselves from all anxiety and fear. Above all, we should confess our sin. Openly acknowledging sin decreases the immediate danger and lessens our anxiety. The heart must be helped first. Confessing sin makes it lighter and allows it to breathe. After this, it's easier to help the rest of the person. Only after our conscience has been released from its heavy load and is able to breathe freely can we find relief for other areas of distress. When God's anger is poured out, we immediately become aware of our sin and become afraid. Foolish people cope with this situation in the wrong way. They ignore their sin and only try to get rid of their fear. That doesn't work, so they eventually fall into despair. This is the way human reason always tries to handle the problem of sin in the absence of God's kindness and spirit. Wise people, however, try to ignore their fear and focus instead on their sin. They acknowledge their sin and try to get rid of it, even if it means that their fear will remain with them, maybe forever. They willingly accept their punishment, as Jonah did in this story. But godless people, Luther writes, do just the opposite. They pay attention to the punishment and are afraid of it, but they aren't concerned about their sin. If there were no punishment, they would never stop sinning. But this isn't what happens because punishment consistently follows sin. In contrast, godly people pay attention to their sin and are afraid of it. They aren't as concerned about the punishment. In fact, it's almost as if they would rather endure the punishment without sinning than commit sin without facing any punishment. The words of Luther. Here again the first sentence he wrote. From the story of Jonah, we learn how to free ourselves from all anxiety and fear. That freedom comes from acknowledging our sin, from turning to God, and from receiving forgiveness of a God who is slow to anger and abounding with steadfast love. May you have a blessed evening.